Pleasure to be here. Yesterday, I was having coffee with this young woman from Everyone, and they've been doing research in the UK, and she said something very interesting. She says, when we ask people about their relationship to technology, they say, I like it, I love my smartphone. And then you say, well, do you think it's good for society? No, I think it's a terrible idea for society. And whenever you have this mismatch between personal convenience and a systemic failure, you know you're bound for all kinds of ethical dilemmas. So I want to ultimately leave you with a few questions. I don't know if I have answers, but I want to leave you with a few questions around the intersection of technology and values. But a little bit of context about my own personal journey to sort of help you frame what I'm going to share. I grew up in the Silicon Valley. I studied computer science and philosophy at UC Berkeley. I got out right at the time of the dot-com sort of heyday. All my peers have started all these companies that have gone, that are now, many of which are now household names. But a part of me at that time, I was optimizing C++ compilers, and a part of me said, what's the next step? I don't think it's starting a dot-com, because I just saw a lot of greed. And I said, well, what resonates with you? And I experimented, and I found my meaning and purpose through service, doing small acts of kindness, but that multiplied one day into a trip to a homeless shelter. 4 of us went, and we said, we can't do what you're doing, but can we help you? And we ended up building them a website, and it felt so great. None of us had ever started an organization. We didn't really want to do anything big in that sense, but it just was so rewarding, we went and told our friends. And our friends are like, that's great, we'll come on to the next project. And like that, from 4 people to 40 to 400 to 4,000, it became this viral story. Now 400,000 people all around the world doing all kinds of different service acts. But what I learned in that whole process, there's that famous quote by Gordon Gekko, greed is good, maybe, but in my experience, what I found was generosity was far better. And what I realized as I gave a little bit more, that as I gave, that you can't really give without receiving, that you're always receiving. And then for me, the third and final stage in my journey of generosity was, well, first you give, then you realize, wow, in giving, I'm actually receiving all the time. And then you stop keeping track of how much you gave and how much you received, because all too often we give in one form of capital, but we're receiving in another form of capital. And we don't always have the right metrics for both of those. They're apples and oranges. You can't really compare them. I learned that in 2005. My wife and I went on a walking pilgrimage across India. Gandhi was a big inspiration. And on our walk, we basically said, we're going to eat whatever food is offered and sleep wherever place is offered. And so can you actually create relationships with people whom you don't know, with whom you may not even have a shared context, but actually your survival depends on that? And what that taught us, it was a profound, life-altering event, paradigm-bending event. But what that really taught us was to reconcile sort of the social network of the internet technology era and the human network of our internet. And I think that's informed a lot of what I do. I didn't know it at the time, but it's really been informative. This is a photo of, you've all probably used Yelp, is what we have in the US, Zomato's, all these restaurant rating services, right? Peer review of restaurants, and we find it pretty meaningful. China's taken it to another level. China says, we're going to help you rate each other. In fact, we're going to mandate that, because we're going to catch those patterns of deviance a lot sooner. And if you don't like that idea of social, and I think this, by the way, was launched last year, so this is not even news now. If you don't like it, the headlines were Big Data meets Big Brother. If you don't like it, we're going to really start to impose some punishments and rewards. We're going to ban you from certain flights and trains, change your internet speeds, prevent access to certain sites, including dating sites, keep you out of top-tier hotels and restaurants, shame you as a bad citizen. And by 2020, 1.2 billion people are going to be required to be part of this social ranking platform. And clearly that raises a lot of alarms, but in so many subtle, devious, subversive ways, we're sort of doing this across the board. We know about the traditional sort of ethical problems, right? Like Volvo cheated on its emissions exam. Uber created gray balls, this software to evade authorities. Palantir unleashed its algorithms on immigrant communities. We know all of that, and we can debate back and forth about whether it's good or bad. But what we're now seeing is a whole new class of challenges that are in the category of unintended consequences. Right? May 10, in 5 minutes, we lost billions and billions of dollars because algorithms were trading against each other, and you had this flash crash. You're seeing more and more of that. Smartphones. The new research came out from Harvard, says if you're near your phone, it actually makes you dumber because you have such a strong association with with this staticky kind of a mindset that actually makes you dumber. And we know that cell phones, are disconnecting us, but we can't let them go. And we know how democracy is being hacked all over the world. So we have a lot of unintended consequences. And the way it usually plays itself out is, well, we have a $400 billion plane. It's going to be manned by pilots. And all of a sudden, some young guy comes in. There's a couple of young guys in this case. And they said, well, we have this Raspberry Pi, which is like this $300 phone at the time, very inexpensive. And they said, well, we've created this technology that's actually better than tactical pilots. And now you combine that with drones, which 80 countries are using, and you say, why should we just have drones or remotely controlled airplanes, right? And why should we even have pilots inside, let alone inside? Why even outside? Let's just have autonomous weapons. This month in particular, there's been huge sort of ruckus around the AI arms race that's going on. So this is the kind of stuff that we don't even really know how to think about. We don't have any regulation. The AI industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry with almost zero regulation because we haven't even learned how to process it, and it's moving really fast. Right? So as we heard in the first presentation, if you, in a very simple way, if you look at the time it took to reach 50 million users, you start with radio, which took 38 years, right? TV, a lot less, with 12 years, and by the time you get to Android, your operating system, you're looking at 18 months. And these adoption ramps are going faster and faster and faster before we can even ask a lot of these deeper questions. We heard about software, running software, right? Google actually realized we need a lot of AI engineers, but it takes 4 years for people to graduate from college and learn these skills. Too slow. Let's create AI that replicates itself. That's what they did. They announced it last year, and a few months later, they actually said, oh, by the way, our AutoML, auto machine learning, language is actually better than all the AI engineers we've hired. So stuff goes fast, right? So I think what we really need is a moral compass. And we haven't really paused enough to ask those questions. We're still talking about Facebook, which is such an old school thing now. We're moved on, and it's going on really fast. This is Sean Parker of Facebook, co-founder, first president, and he says it very clearly. He says, how do we consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible? Well, this is our design process. We give you a little dopamine hit, someone likes or comments on your photo, and you'll be a sucker and want to contribute more and more content. It's called social validation feedback loop. And as a parent, he says, we were exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology. The inventors, all of us, me, Mark Zuckerberg, Kevin Systrom from Instagram, all these people, we knew it, and we did it anyways. And this is a beautiful quote by a Chinese philosopher. He says, off by an inch in the beginning, off by 10,000 miles at the end. So how do we start to catch these things in the beginning? I think if you look at technology, in a very simple way, what we're doing is we take a lot of processing power. Moore's Law, 1960, one chip had one transistor. Today, IBM last year announced a 4 nanogram, something that fits on a fingernail, has 30 billion transistors. 30 billion. I mean, the amount of computing power we have is staggering. You add to that data. 90% of all data human race has ever collected, ever gathered, has been done in the last 2 years. If you type it all up, double-sided, and stack up all those sheets of paper, it would be greater than the distance from here to the sun and back twice every day. It's huge. It's massive. And you add to that algorithms, right? All these technologies, and what we get is control. And now the question is, what are we going to do with those controls? What are the questions that we're going to ask with that kind of control? And Google, we know, is asking questions like this, because there's a big market demand. Can Google solve death? right? Lots of people working on that. I was speaking in Munich after Google brand ambassador, and I gave examples of love and forgiveness, and I said, where are the predictive algorithms that are going to solve for this? Or should we even be solving for this? Is that even the right question? So I think, as Einstein said, if I had an hour to solve a problem and my life depended on it, I would use the first 55 minutes to make sure I'm asking the right questions. So I want to leave you with 3 questions that I have been holding. But before that, a little sort of design overview. Right? This is how internet technology, a lot of technologies start. You have a user and an engineer. Engineer is very excited, someone like me, like, hey, I got all these cool things I can do. I'm going to dump it onto you. And you're like, oh my God, so many options, so many things. You bring in a designer, UX designer, and you simplify it. You say, boom, just 3 things. Everyone can do it. You go a little step further, and you say, look, let's do all the hard work on the back end, make this super simple. My grandma can use the iPad. Fantastic. You just hit a few buttons. Everything works. The problem with this is that it starts to become a black box. And we have no idea what's happening on the back end. On the front end, what they call user-centered design is actually dumbing the user in so many ways. So it starts to raise a lot of questions when we don't know what's actually going on in the back end. So here are the 3 questions that I would leave you with. Right? Ratio, first, there are 3 R's. It just so happened. One is about ratio, right? Is technology growing, or is the person using the technology growing? What we're seeing right now is that technology is growing. It's becoming massive, right? So many different options, and we're becoming smaller and smaller. So what is that ratio, and can we retain that ratio? What does it take to retain that ratio? Second is about relationships. Right? Are we getting isolated or more connected? Because what technology does is creates these filter bubbles, these echo chambers. All the algorithms, I mean, we've all heard of all kinds of different examples around it, but are we really just creating smaller and smaller echo chambers? Are we reaching out? And third is about resilience. That when you have these complex systems behind a black box, what you end up with, you feel like, oh my God, I'm like teetering on the edge. You know? Are you really hanging by a thread, or are we actually creating resilient systems? Resiliency for us, resiliency for our interactions with each other at an interpersonal level and at a systemic level. So in Service Space, which is the organization I run, which is an incubator of lots of different projects, we've been holding these questions. And as you hold them for a while, you arrive at a few very different designs. So we started to look at all the capital we had, different forms of capital, and we said, how can you apply this to things where, to do projects that money can't really touch? And things like Good News Portal. Very hard to monetize good news, which is why CNN doesn't do it. Right? So you say, wow, can we do that? Kindness, for example. Very hard to monetize because its impact is distributed. So can we create a kindness portal? And so we go back on and on and on. And we created this. Some of these projects are also offline. Smile cards. You do a small little act. It's a little game. You do a small little act. I actually have a bunch of smile cards for those that want them. You do a small act of kindness, and you leave a smile card behind. Tells the person you don't know who did this for you, pay it forward. So you pay for the coffee for the person behind you. You know, maybe you go thank a public servant. You leave flowers for someone anonymously. Card says, you don't know who did this. Can you pay it forward? And then we took it a step further, and we said, can we run a restaurant in this way? So Karma Kitchen, some of you might have heard of it. All these things happen here in London as well. Karma Kitchen, you walk in, and your check at the end of your meal reads 0 because someone before you has paid for you, and you are invited to pay forward whatever you want for people after you. You're like, you can't trust human beings like that. Harvard came to study us, and they're like, this is great. It works here in Berkeley. I don't think it's going to work anywhere else. Now it's in 23 places around the world. And it starts to create a different narrative that maybe we're not all that selfish as we thought we were. And like that, like the projects go on. But underneath it, I would say that if there's one flip that we've made, we use a lot of technology, even to organize a thing like Karma Kitchen, which is offline, or something like Smile Cards, which actually creates a ripple, starts on a network, and then goes off into the human network, which for Facebook would be a terrible thing. Instead of me giving you a hug, they would rather have you give virtual hugs because they want you to stay on the network, because they want to monetize your attention. But how do we start to flip some of this? And so I think the big flip that we have done is to, it used to be that necessity is the mother of invention. But as we heard, like the iPhone X, right? The invention now becomes the mother of necessity. It's there, so I need it. As opposed to, why do we need it? We've forgotten to ask the why. We're just chasing after, just because I can do it, I do it. And I think at its core, what we need to do is we know that on the tip of the iceberg, we see the Internet of Things. But for every iceberg, 10% is what we see, 90% is below the surface. And below the surface is the Internet of life, right? Is our human connection at the level of consciousness. The question is, where does the arrow go? Right? Are we going to start with the Internet of Things and say, here's the problem, and by the way, I do want you to connect at a human level, FYI, or are we going to be the other way? Right? We start with the Internet of life, and actually all our technologies are in service to that Internet. I think that's the core question. And if I had to leave you with one thing, right, like what could I do? How could I do it? My solution is very simple. Right? We ultimately design who we are. So yes, we can talk about policies. Yes, we can talk about projects. Yes, we can talk about innovation. I think all those things are meaningful. But until we actually realize the power of this at the level of our own experience, I don't think it's going to go too far. So how do we design ultimately who we are? So if we go out, like the one thing you say, well, you have questions, I have questions. Maybe some of those questions resonate with you. You might have other questions. But ultimately, I think we'll find our answers individually and collectively if we start to step into that space and do those little acts, right? Go out and touch somebody's life, see how that experience, it creates an external ripple effect, but it also creates an internal ripple effect. And that's the human network. That's our Internet. And I think if we learn to lead with that through our own experiences, we'll ask different questions and create different designs in society. Thank you so much.